We're not even talking about reconstruction. So I can't predict what's going to happen, but I think we have to be realistic about what did happen. And of those 3 stages in the ceasefire agreement, I find it wholly implausible that it's going to go beyond hostage for hostage, so President Trump can boast that his threat to let loose hell on Gaza was, it filled the people of Hamas with dread and they agreed to the hostage exchange. But beyond that, does anyone seriously believe that President Trump is going to insist that the Israelis allow in humanitarian aid? That doesn't sound very plausible. Does anyone believe that President Trump is going to insist that the Israelis allow for the reconstruction in Gaza with the people remaining? That doesn't sound very plausible. So it's a very grim picture. And how to go forward, on that aspect, I am unclear. But there are other things that need to be done. And when the question is asked of me, I will speculate on how we should go forward here, not there, here.
And as a frame of reference, I think you perfectly illustrated the level of destruction, 50 million rubbles. And just to let everyone know, some parts of the ceasefire agreement that have been publicized have said that a timeline of 3 to 5 years of rebuilding Gaza is what they're going to put in place. Even Trump's Middle East special envoy called this preposterous. And just as a frame of reference, that new chemistry building on campus took 6 years to design and build. And they want to allow 3 to 5 years worth of reconstruction in Gaza to rebuild the entirety of the Gaza Strip. How do you think they came up with that number? I mean, this is absurd. Is it something they threw in there?
When you follow the conflict closely, you discover that all the numbers are completely made up. Every number is just pulled from thin air. It's so laughable. I'll just give you a few examples to illustrate the point. The New York Times, which is the main Israeli newspaper in the United States, the New York Times reports things like there are 450 miles of tunnels in Gaza. 450 miles. They say, our sources, our secret sources. There's this Israeli intelligence agent who masquerades as a reporter for the Times named Roland Bergman. And he says, according to my sources, what's his sources? His sources is the Mossad. They want to feed this information to the United States. They throw numbers at him. 450 miles of tunnels. So I was curious about that number. Where did they come up with it? How many people have been to New York City in this room? Raise your hand. Oh, fine. How many people have rode the subway system? Good. So it's a pretty complex, rarefied subway system. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A line, B line, C line, D line, all the way to Z, some letters missed. It's a very complex system. So I did a little research the way young people do now. I go on the web. I decided to be a moron for a day. And I looked up how many miles are in the New York City subway system. 430. So you're telling me that there are more there are more miles of subway, of tunnels. I say 430 miles of tunnels. 430 miles of tunnels in the New York City subway system. So you're telling me there are more tunnels in Gaza than there are in my New York City subway system? No, that's not really believable. That's not really believable. I checked with some civil engineers in Gaza and said it's complete nonsense. Even Sinwar, who was given to, the late Mr. Sinwar, who was given to boasting, that's part of the psychological game, I get it. He said 300 miles of tunnels, but Israel says 430. Why they 450? Why do they say 450? Because then it justifies destroying all of Gaza. You can always say we're targeting tunnels. So it pulls the number out of thin air. Then the figure for the number of Hamas combatants killed. How could you possibly know that number? First of all, the Israeli Gaza Ministry of Health says we don't know the number. And they deal with the dead bodies. It's not as if members of Hamas walk around with an ID card that says terrorist. No. How would they know? Everything is obliterated. Before the Israeli, the IDF as it's called, before it takes one step, it obliterates everything in front of it. How would they know how many Hamas militants are buried there? If you follow the numbers as I do, you know what the number always is. It's very simple. Whatever is the total figure for the number of Gazans who are estimated to have been killed, Israel will say the number of combatants killed is in a proportion of either 1 or 1.5 to 2. So let's say if the official number of Gazans killed is 40,000, Israel will say 18,000 were Hamas terrorists. Why do they do that? Because they want to say this is the cleanest war ever fought. That the ratio is usually 1 to 6, one combatant for 6 civilians or one combatant for 9 civilians. So they'll say in Gaza it's 1 or 1.5 to 2. So they simply calculate the number of combatants to show that this is the cleanest war ever fought in the history of humankind. All the numbers are just completely made up. When you look at them closely, or if you have any sense of what's going on there, ironically, and it is ironically, I think, the Israelis and their propagandists said the Gaza Ministry of Health was exaggerating the number of people killed. And along comes an article in Lancet, the most respected medical journal in the world. It's a British medical journal. And they said, yes, it's true. The Gaza Ministry of Health was exaggerating downward, that the number of people in Gaza killed was probably about 40% more than the Gaza Ministry of Health was saying. So, yes, it was exaggerated, as the Israelis say, but it was exaggerated downward, not upward.
So I'd like to bring up the topic of Arab governments, a particularly popular topic in this room, I presume, but Arab governments have largely remained passive spectators, as Gaza has been reduced to rubble, despite their immense wealth and influence. While some have made symbolic gestures or pledged aid, many continue to normalize ties with Israel or avoid direct confrontation. So, what role should the Arab governments play in, let's say, rebuilding Gaza or relieving the population of Gaza from this destruction?
I'm not going to talk to the should, because there the answer is obvious. I want to talk about what the historical record shows. There was a period when the Palestine cause had immense, not material power, obviously, didn't have an army or economic wealth, but it had something else, and it's an interesting fact. It had quite significant symbolic power, which is to say, Arab governments genuinely feared the Palestinian cause. So if you take one example, which I'm familiar with because I've studied the historical record, Jimmy Carter recently passed. He was an extremely smart guy, and in his own way, he was an honorable guy. He was an awful president. And he was the one that negotiated the Israel-Egypt agreement beginning in 1977 and climaxing in 1979. And it was very impressive to read the historical record. He just knew exactly what to do. He was very systematic, very methodical, and he had a terrifying grasp of detail. I mean, it would take your breath away to read, because we have the original documents, and how he makes these marginal comments. You know, when his advisors present to him some agreement to read or pertaining to Israel-Palestine, and you read his marginal comments and the level of micro detail that he had mastered is totally breathtaking. In any event, when he comes into office, he's determined he's going to solve the whole Israel-Palestine conflict. He then realizes that the Israelis are too dug in their heels. You can't do it. The only thing the Israelis were willing to do was to sign an agreement with Egypt. And the reason was very simple. It'll be a big surprise among young people, but Egypt was the powerhouse of the Arab world up until this Camp David agreement that was negotiated by President Carter, or through President Carter. And the foreign minister at the time, who was also prominent in the military establishment, was a fellow named Moshe Dayan. And Dayan famously said, if you remove one wheel from a car, the car is stuck. It can't move. And so he said, if we remove the Egyptian wheel from the Arab front, they can't make war anymore, because Egypt was the powerhouse. We removed the Egyptian wheel. So Israel didn't want another war like 1973, which was a pretty big catastrophe for them in many ways. The estimates are between 2,000 and 3,000 Israeli combatants were killed. And for a while, it looked like Israel was going to disappear. Turned out to be inflated, that fear, but it was actually believed. So they wanted to make the Arab world impotent, and the way they thought to do it was to remove the Egyptian wheel from the car. So Israel was willing to sign an agreement with Egypt, but no more. Whereas the Arab world wanted to just solve the problem. That is, a two-state settlement according to international law. The Palestinians have the right to self-determination and statehood in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, and so forth. So why do I bring all this up? I bring it up because Jimmy Carter, being very systematic and methodical, He tours the whole Arab world. He goes to the Saudis, of course, and he says, if there's an agreement between Egypt and Israel, will you support it? The Saudis say, nope, we can't do anything unless you give the Palestinians a state. Now remember, Palestine, they have no material power. They have no military power. But they have this tremendous symbolic power in the Arab world. The Arab head of state says, we cannot agree to a deal that doesn't give the Palestinians a state. And Sadat, as you can imagine, he's panicking. Because if he can't get any support from the Arab world for this agreement, then it's going to make him look like a traitor. And you know what happens to traitors? They get shot. And so in many ways, Jimmy Carter was responsible for Sadat's assassination because he insisted on the deal in the absence of any Arab support. Now, I want to be clear, Sadat wanted the deal too, for sure, because the country was going through food riots, it was very unstable, and he just wanted the American money. He just wanted the American money. He wanted to join the American alliance. He basically, if you read the record, he said to Carter, you do whatever you want and I'll agree with you. Whatever you want, you just do it and I'll sign. And so he was, Jimmy Carter was Egypt's negotiator. So that's no longer true. Palestine doesn't have symbolic value the way it once did in the Arab world. And the question is why? I think the obvious answer is because since that era, there have been so many catastrophes in the Arab world. There's been Iraq, there's been Libya, there's been there's been Syria, and on, that the horror of the situation among the Palestinians began to pale in the face of now the inward-looking countries of the Arab world, faced with all of their own domestic calamities and catastrophes. I'm not making an apology, I'm simply stating the facts. There were about 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. That's the total population of Gaza, these numbers. And these are the catastrophes that have befallen the Arab world. Having said that, the fact remains, and it is a fact, apart from the Houthis in Yemen and the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Arab world abandoned the people of Gaza. They abandoned them. In fact, if we're honest about it, and I know I'll probably get some disagreement, and you're free to disagree, so did the West Bank. If you look at the various operations I mentioned, there was very little support in the West Bank for the people of Gaza. Very little. During the Great March of Return in March 2018, there was no support, none in the West Bank, for the nonviolent civil resistance in Gaza. The fact of the matter is, if you put aside the Houthis in Yemen and the Hezbollah in Lebanon, You know where he came from? South Africa. South Africa was so tenacious. What does the word tenacious mean? Anyone know? What? Persistent. They were so tenacious. Most of you know some of the record, but you don't know all of the record. So as you know, they wrote, they submitted December 29th, 2023, what they called an application to the ICJ, International Court of Justice, charging that Israel was in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. Their application was 84 pages. It was single-spaced. It had over 500 footnotes. And for each footnote, there were like 3 references. It was a huge amount of work. Huge amount of work. Israel ignored what the ICJ ruled in January. I won't go through the record now. If you ask me later, I'm happy to. They go before the court again in February. They submit a new compilation of documentation. The court says Israel has to do what it was ordered to do in January. It repeats that. Israel ignores. South Africa goes before them again in March. Another thick compilation of facts, statistics, references, and so forth. And then guess what? It goes before them again in May. It keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And then, for those of you who are interested, if you go to, it's called Letter to the Security Council, Letter to the Security Council, May 29th, 2024. They give up at the ICJ because Israel is ignoring it, and they now go to the Security Council. And they say, Israel is ignoring what the ICJ said, you have to act. And they submit a compilation, it's 121 pages. And it is so meticulously documented. It's just a breathtaking amount of work and investment. And now the case itself is before the court. And hold your breath. They submitted a 750-page, what's called memorial, with 4,000 pages of supplementary documentation. 750 pages with 4,000 pages of supplementary documentation. Now you ask yourself, what did the rest of the Arab world do? I think the silence answers the question, as in nothing. I don't blame the people. I'm sure their hearts go out. Why the Houthis? Why are they so adamant? You know why? Because what was done to Gaza was done to them. The Saudi blockade. The Saudi blockade, which I think killed in 2 years, I don't remember the exact number, but something like 80,000 people died from starvation because of those Saudi monsters. So they know what was done, what's being done to Gaza, was done to them. And the Hezbollah, you know, people want to say it's manipulated by Iran. You can't deny the fact that Iran is a factor. But my own estimate, I'm not going to argue with people because I know people from Syria have very good, sincere, legitimate grievances against the Hezbollah, and I'm not going to quarrel with that. But I think on the whole, Said Nasrallah was an extremely intelligent, honorable, and dignified figure, and I think his death left a huge void in the Arab world. He was a new voice. He was a new voice in the Arab world. He carried, some of you know the person Edward Said. And when Hassan Nasrallah was a young man, Edward Said met him, and he wrote just briefly about him because he wasn't well known at the time. Professor Said wrote about him, and he said there's two things about Nasrallah which differ from any other Arab leader I've ever met. Number one, he was always on time. No, it's a sign. It's a sign of seriousness. You know, the other Arab leaders, they're coming 5 hours late, like they're so important, and everybody else's time is unimportant. So they'll come in 5 hours late, 7 hours late, and he was always on time. And number two, all the other Arab leaders he met, meaning Professor Said, they were always surrounded by armed militia with their machine guns. He said when he met no, none of those theatrics. He was serious. He read. I remember Professor Chomsky met him. They met for a serious amount of time. And he asked Professor Chomsky, so what was he like? And Professor Chomsky will say, you don't really know because all he did was ask questions. He just wanted to suck in information. He wasn't there to show off, to show how important he is. He wanted to learn. He was serious. He made errors. We all make errors. At the end, pure speculation. I admit it, pure speculation. I think he died a martyr's death. He knew he wanted to be killed because he had what you call command responsibility. And there were many mistakes made at the end. There were deep penetrations of Hezbollah intelligence, and also he was the last of his generation. Israel had assassinated him in those months, all of the senior leaders except him. And I think there was a feeling that he wanted to die an honorable death. Because anybody who knew Hezbollah, they had headquarters buried deep inside mountains. They said, I don't know if it's true, you could have dropped an atomic bomb in the mountain and it still wouldn't penetrate their headquarters. So why did he go to the Dahya? He knew there were 10,000 spies there, that Israel was watching it. Israel was bombing it all week. I think he died a martyr's death. And it was an honorable death. I think it was a mistake because it left a huge gap. But that's his calculation. Apart from him, the rest are all from hunger.
You mentioned some examples of militant actions that some Arab countries or entities stationed in Arab countries have taken. And you also mentioned non-violent civil resistance, but you've also been a vocal critic of the boycott, divestment, sanction movement in the past, despite its goal of applying non-violent pressure on Israel to comply with international law. Given the scale of the atrocities in Gaza, mass killing, destruction, apartheid, many argue that BES is one of the few tools available to hold or to legitimately hold Israel accountable. So why do you oppose BES, and do you still stand by that position in light of Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza?
I want to answer two questions.